uh, integrity with that day. So I think we can say the schedule has not been impacted in terms of that being modified at all. Whoa, Doug. Sorry about that. A few notes of concern, in addition to having missed things last time and mentioning that. I would like to identify a bit of detail about the midterm and field questions that you may have in that regard, and provide a reminder that today is the deadline to register to vote. So I will simply encourage you to recognize the importance of that activity. And I know that in California, you can register online, so kind of a painless thing, and you should be able to squeeze that in without much issue. And I would certainly hope that by now you're all registered already. But if that's not the case, this is your last chance today to get that step checked and knock it out to allow yourself the opportunity to vote in the November 3rd election. So with everything going on from COVID to social unrest, I think there's a lot of importance on this election, and I won't get into politicizing matters here, but simply indicate that I feel it is quite important, especially in light today. We have a comment from the president identifying the top infectious disease expert as a disaster because he's talking about the infectious disease.
Can I just add, Professor?
What's that?
It took me about 2 minutes to register, and it's the easiest thing in the world. The ballot got mailed to me. I just stick it back in the mail when it's done.
Cool. Good stuff. Nothing to it. Thank you, Evan. So if you haven't, please do that, take care of that, and help our society along as we can. That's the point of it. Back to this. So we have the midterm next time. And on that, it will include coverage through bearing capacity. And I think we can include with that the lateral loading of foundations. I won't try to sneak the material in today, the eccentrically loaded, although I'm not going to be having homework assignments related to that, so it wouldn't make much difference. But just as a matter of fairness, I won't spring this on you 48 hours before the exam and say it's going to be on there. So we'll leave that if it would be covered in exam format for the final exam, but through lateral loading of foundations, let's say. And that encompasses the geotech review. I will remind you of the importance of the geotech component here. This is a geotech course, and you need those building blocks to be able to successfully design and analyze foundations. I think that the process of analyzing and designing, you've now had strong experience with that through development of a spreadsheet and completion of a homework. In this regard, I would hope you'd agree with me, except for some syntax with, programming and so on, and that making you pull your hair out potentially, as debugging tends to do. Aside from that, it is a reasonably straightforward process, kind of a cookbook type process. And as long as you know where to go, and hey, I need to go there to get NC, NQ, and gamma. I need to go there to get shape factors, depth factors. I don't need shape factor, depth factor because I'm doing Terzaghi, that sort of thing. I need the water table correction, or which case are we? I need the third term gamma, what's going on underneath the foundation, that sort of thing. I think that you'll find that to be reasonably straightforward. However, behind the scenes in all of that, there is the need for you to be establishing what is the effective stress at a given point. The Q naught for the second term at the base of the foundation. What is the strength of soil, given some data from, for instance, triaxial test or direct shear test or standard penetration test, whatever it would be. You need to be able to wring out and make some sense of what is phi and what is C for a given soil. So it's oftentimes that's where the difficulty comes in these problems. So don't feel that since you have the cookbook routine down that you're all set to blindly coast through this thing, because it is the geotech stuff that often ends up being a difficult point in the problem. So I'll remind you of that now so that you are ready for that and have appropriate notes and so on ready to go. It is an entirely open book, open notes examination format. I would like to limit it where you are not utilizing communication methods with each other or anyone else, or internet in any manner. I would like to contain this to open paper, is how I will describe it. If you do have an electronic copy of the text, I would allow you access to that. But that would be the limit of what I would intend for you to be accessing with the use of computer. The spreadsheets, for example, will not be utilized or allowed during the exam time. And I will have an honor code that you'll be signing as completion, as part of completion of the exam. And I do hope you'll respect and honor that. That will identify that you will adhere to these requirements, that it will be, hey, open papered books, you can have whatever you want around you, open, tabbed, I'm all set to go. Hey, that's where I have my notes on direct shear. Over for 381, I go over there to get something on triaxial tests and so on. I think a big part of open book, open notes tests is outright organization and being able to put your finger on something quite readily and in a hurry. So be ready for that. I think that will serve you well to spend some of your time studying, preparing to be able to get to things reasonably quickly, whether it's an index for your own notes or putting some tabs on things with Post-its or whatever format suits you. It's a good skill set to have. And you'll be needing that in the future for exams such as the FE and PE exams as well. So it's a good mindset to get into being ready for that sort of activity in an exam setting. So the exam will cover the geotech stuff, the site characterization material, and in situ testing, as well as bearing capacity. So there's plenty there, I'll say, to entertain you. And I'm envisioning having some problems that would be generally short answer, true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, super short essay, just more or less have a statement, describe something briefly or, meaning in one sentence kind of thing. But in that section, things worth 2 to 5 points or something like that each, and accumulated to be about 20% of the examination. So 20% would be short answer of some sort. And then moving on to questions. And those would be more numerical in nature, mimicking more of the homework type problems, things that you see in lecture example problems. Speaking of homework, by the way, I have posted solutions to homeworks 1 and 2. And now that 3 has been submitted, I will post number 3 as well today. So you'll have access to those as well for comparing to your own work and identifying any issues with progress that you may have. So the numerical problems will tend to be, I would say, generally between 15 and 20 points, somewhere, around there ish, let's say. It could be a little more, a little less than that range, depending how things work out and how involved they are. But that should give you an idea that you can expect to have on the order of 5 or 6 problems total on the exam, one being a short answer, and then a handful of extra questions that will be more numerical in nature. And I'll let you kind of connect some dots on thinking about things. Okay, what are some big hitting items? Well, you got some in situ tests. There's several big ones that would be of great concern, that are kind of the primary methods for characterization. Some possibly not so well known. May not be quite as involved in a problem. And then for bearing capacity, we certainly have the Terzaghi arena, the VASIC arena, design and analysis available. So you can probably consider there'll be a selection of some of those. Some combination of that matrix would be present in the exam. Are there questions related to format on the exam? Or anything in terms of that?
Will we have a few minutes after the exam is finished to scan in our work and submit that, or will that also be due right at the end of the exam?
I will certainly provide a few extra minutes. Absolutely. I'll be, I'll call it forgiving on the deadline time. I'll ask that you quit writing, and again, honor code stuff, that you follow that and so on. But, afterward, I figure it'll take you 5 minutes or something to click, run through and grab the scans and then submit them on the Canvas site. All right.
I just want to make sure for the open note part, is our 381 notes, those are fair game?
Absolutely. I'll call it open paper. If this were literally in person, it would be open paper. You could bring in whatever paper you want.
Okay. I just wanted to check. Thank you.
Most certainly. Yeah, I would encourage you to have your 381 notes and use them for your careers, literally. I mean, that's not a bad, you're in university, there's more to it than just grabbing a grade at the end of the term. This is an archive of resources for you that will be available for the long haul. And you'll find value in those notes as you took them. They mean more to you than anyone, hopefully. So I think that those are great resources. Absolutely. I encourage you to use them. Other questions?
I had a question about the spreadsheets due today.
Yep.
It's due after class today. Would we have a little bit of extra time to turn it in? Or is that 4 o'clock deadline set?
How many would, be needing an extra bit of time? Are there a bunch? I'm willing to work on you, I'll say, with a, case by case.
Yes.
I as well.
Okay.
Extend.
It sounds like plenty. And I don't want this to steer away from your other material, either in the course or in other courses for that matter, and have this class take over everything. But it is an important exercise in the class. And how about we go with a 10 a.m. tomorrow deadline instead, and give you the night to hammer away at it if that would be required. And I have it set up in Canvas that you're able to submit multiple times. So you should be able to retract your work and submit a new one if you've submitted something already that you don't feel was a final polished product. All right. Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Will the exam be posted onto Canvas at 2, or are we just to access it and then do it on our
It will
within
be
the
available as a PDF shortly before 2, or right around 2. Not shortly before 2:10, I should say. So if you're ready and got your materials together, you should have an opportunity, if needed, to print it and have it then available, if that's the mode that you choose to work in. If you want to just look at it on the screen, that's absolutely fine as well. I will have you preparing answer sheets separate from the question sheets anyway, so it wouldn't matter in terms of mode. And I'll leave you the choice of what kind of paper you want to use, whatever you like to use, as long as it is legible and clean and so on. But engineering paper, line paper, plain paper, whatever you like is fine with me. So, other questions?
I can't remember if you said this already, but we're supposed to come to class normally on Zoom, right?
It is my intent that we'll be logged in and,
Okay.
having a live session during the exam. That is my intent, yes. Thank you for highlighting that, as that is more or less an expectation. I'd like to have it where you're showing your video and so on. I won't outright require it, but it's appropriate, I'd say, for proctoring an exam. And if there happen to be questions, that way they're easily handled in live time and so on. And if there would be something that needs to get announced to everyone, hey, number 7 is goofy, it would allow for remedying something like it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
You bet. Other questions? All righty. You guys are all set for it, and I'm not worried. I'm here. One sec. Okay, I would like to share a screen here that will have some information with eccentrically loaded foundations. And one application where this does occur quite commonly is that of retaining walls. And you want the resultant of combined loading from retaining walls. And what I'm speaking of there is vertical plus horizontal. There'd be some lateral earth pressure acting on the wall. You want that to reside within the middle third, shown here in turquoise, of your foundation base. And generally that's what you're after when designing foundations of shallow foundation style, that you'd want the resultant to be within that middle third. And in the case of retaining wall, or for that matter, other foundations, you can adjust the base dimension accordingly until it fits within that middle third. And there's still, even if you're in the middle third, you're not entirely out of the woods. You still need to make some adjustments in the calculations, and we'll look through those today. But as a just starting point, this is, in a sense, what you're after for a big picture goal on an application of this sort. would be that you're trying to be near the center of the foundation. Sometimes you end up where you're not at the center, and some of it can be due to a combined load effect, in which a moment produced by a lateral load, for instance, is causing a virtual eccentricity, or you could have a physical eccentricity being present in a system due to a column not being in the middle of the foundation. And that would probably be much less common, but does occur if you have, an oddball property boundary or something like that, or relationship between a building and property boundary. That's where you would end up with having eccentrically loaded foundations where it is a column that's off center rather than this version. So combined loading will cause this virtual eccentricity that I was speaking of. So the moment can be equated to an eccentricity that's equal to moment over load. So the foundation is loaded like this with a combination of load and moment. You equate the moment, or that combination, I should say, to an eccentricity. And this load down here in the lower right corner is equivalent to the upper left corner. Those two are the same thing as far as the foundation is concerned. Mechanically, it is the same. And the E that would be introduced, the eccentricity that would be introduced, is moment over vertical load. So it will be a function of both of those. And an alternate to that, as I mentioned, is an actual physical movement of the column or physical placement of the column, that it's not in the middle of the foundation. And if in either case the resultant load resides within the kern of a foundation, that's this diamond shape here that represents in 2 dimensions now the middle third of the foundation, stresses of compressive nature will be present over the entire footprint of the foundation of the base.
Could you just go back one slide?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, just a moment here. If you have an off-center foundation, it will tend to look something like this. in which your shallow foundation, I should say, is here, a stem not being in the middle, being off center, the resultant load against that, or the stress distribution in the soil against that, is going to be biased towards the end where your column is located. And if you hit the 1/3 mark with your foundation, where you are no longer within that 1/3 distance here, you will actually have a zero compressive load at that location. So it will tend to bias in this direction increasingly as that column moves. And when you hit that 1/3 mark, you would be right at that location. And if you go beyond that, meaning keep moving continue to move the column further eccentrically loaded, you'll actually cross over and have a tension zone in the foundation soil interface. And that, as you may imagine, would be quite problematic from a support standpoint. We're counting on the soil being there to resist the loading being applied. And let me just write this here. For an eccentricity greater than B/6, you're going to end up with a situation. I won't even show the column in this case. I'll just indicate that it's a large eccentricity. You would have and we have a tension zone over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Looking like that. So for eccentricity greater than B/6, again, outside that 1/3 of the foundation. So over here, for instance, if this is your stem of your footing, you'll develop that tension zone. So it's at a load or at an eccentricity of B/6 that this will equal 0. And if it's less than B/6, you'll actually have a numerical value here and a different numerical value here. In nice engineer land, we like to consider that the stress acting at the base of a foundation is uniformly distributed over the base. That's a stretch in a big way with soils and concrete footings due to stress concentrations being present and so on. And the soil beneath the foundation changing as it's loaded. So there's a number of confounding factors. But in any event, there is the possibility to develop this tension zone. And as far as the foundation is concerned, you can just lop off that portion that's in tension. It's doing no good in terms of resisting loading. It's more or less tipping upward at that point. So it's not, in fact, assisting with resistance of the column load.
So is the tension zone typically ignored, or can it become so great where it has to be addressed in projects?
It does need to be addressed, and we actually address it mathematically with what I'm about to show. There is an equation provided by Salgado, and this is equation 1048, I believe. I want to confirm that before jotting it down as the keeper. I think that is what it is, and we're on page 456 in this case. Absolutely, that is it. So 1048. And Salgado has some reasonably nice images in this regard of this happening in 2 dimensions or 3D, I guess, in terms of if your load is eccentric in actually 2 dimensions here. So here he has, this is figure 1027. The foundation pad itself and the column being loaded upward and to the front. Upward and to the right, I should say. So in that quadrant where there's eccentricity identified in both the B and the L directions. And with that being present, which you would have here, the resistance to that, the stress acting at the base would look like this. And this is a highly idealized contact stress distribution. So it's tweaking the engineered version where it's just uniform everywhere slightly to account for this bias towards, in this case, one corner. And it could be one end as well. But it's equation 1049 of interest here. And that will be that on that base, you have a QB. And that's going to be the resistance stress acting on the base of the concrete. And I'd like to compute this for both a maximum and a minimum. This is Q over BL times 1 plus or minus 6 times eccentricity in the B direction over B plus or minus 6 eccentricity in the L direction over L. That's equation 1049 on page 457. So you can get a little more detail in relation to where that comes from and so on. But this can be utilized to identify the actual bias. Whereas if it is concentrically loaded, in other words, the same as everything we've been doing up until this point in the course, QB would simply be the load on the column divided by BL, and all of this stuff would go away. And it's the eccentricity that brings in there being a differential here, a differential from the left and right sides here. And the pluses would, of course, account for the max. The minuses would account for the mins in this equation. And where we're going with this is that you will have effective dimensions of the footing. And one of these is called B prime, and the other is called L prime. look like this. So we're actually going to change our dimensions. I talked about lopping off, just cutting off the foundation where I showed it, where it gets into that tension zone. And even if it's not going all the way to tension, you still have a correction that is made that is provided for with this mathematics here. I'll show you that on the foundation itself to show what it looks like. So we have this kern. Again, that's your target. You want to be in the middle. It's not all that essential that you be there. It's outside of that diamond area that you get into having some tension zones in the footing. So it's most certainly not prudent. You wouldn't want to design to have this, but it's not, you know, your building isn't necessarily going to collapse if you have a loading that's occurring outside of this kern. It just wouldn't be good practice to be outside of that. So we have a dimension here of B and L. Those are good old dimensions from the basic rectangular foundation. L is always the larger dimension, by the way. And I'm showing it here with an E sub B, an eccentricity in the B direction. To keep the diagram clean, I did not show it, but there's also an eccentricity in the L direction, which would be this vertical distance from the centroid of the foundation on up to the new column area, or the column area, I should say, the actual column area. And these equations we just saw, B prime is B minus 2 eccentricity in the B direction, and L prime is L minus 2 times eccentricity in the L direction. The new dimensions are shown on the graphic over here. And effectively what this mathematical step is doing is recentering your column. That's all it's doing. So it's quite, clever approach to just say, all right, we're going to recenter however far out it is. We'll recenter it and identify materials in that regard. If we look at bearing pressures acting on the base of the foundation, I'll hold on here. Before we get into this, I have one more aspect to cover here. Okay, two other items here that come into play on when these problems would be used in practice, and if you're using these, what you'd have to do with them. At this stage, now that you have B prime and L prime, you will use the bearing capacity equation with B prime in the third term instead of B, and use B prime L prime for the area calculation. I'll make a note of that, that's both area will equal B prime times L prime. And this can be considered an effective area for that foundation. And you will use regular BNL, however, for shape and depth factors. And I'll note that this second point is somewhat controversial in the literature. And I have seen this published elsewhere, in which they recommend using B prime L prime for the shape and depth, but I'm not going to go down that path nor make the arguments and so on. I'll just let you know that for your own perspective, if you go out into practice and you find a problem and you dig up some old text and so on, and you say, boy, oh boy, I don't remember this being B prime L prime. There are some authors that have presented this as that being the appropriate method. So I'll just let you know that that exists out there, and they're, full on trustworthy kind of authors. It's just a difference in methodology. I am trusting here Salgado as he presents BNL. He is really a mathematician's mathematician, and I expect he's looked good and long at this before publishing it as just saying, use BNL. So with that, the rest would just be a normal type foundation problem. And there'd be a limited, selection of problems that you'd be dealing with in this, but it might be something, again, you're near a property line and you have to be, the column load has to be 3 feet from the property boundary, just a matter of the building being there. It has to be there. However, a 6-foot foundation may not be enough. So what you do in that case is then build the foundation out only in one direction, because the property line will dictate where the end of construction will be present, not simply the what's above ground, but that applies to underground material as well. Questions on eccentrically loaded foundations?
So
yeah, go ahead.
The kern you were talking about,
yes.
Is it a diamond because it's representing the middle third of each?
That is correct. Yep.
Okay.
So mathematically, that's how it will show up, that you are guaranteeing that you are within the middle third on an area basis.
Okay. And so how you said it's an idealized concept to have a perfectly distributed stress under a footing. So if the column was perfectly in the middle third of the footing, it wouldn't be considered uniform loading because of the properties of the soil, or just
I'll show you a slide. It's the next slide. I actually showed it already and didn't talk about it because it's getting a little bit ahead, but it sort of leads into stress distribution, but it seems a good point to share it given that there's a question about it. And it would look like this. So the bearing pressure for a concentrically loaded foundation in all 3 cases here is going to look like this for an engineered interpretation of what's happening. We keep things simple. So we just say, hey, stress equals load over area. That's what's going on. That's in our, idealized world and, let the world be round and make sense and all of this. But in reality, if you're working with granular soils, you're going to have a stress distribution something like this. And what's going on here is that you actually have a densification of sand occurring beneath that foundation. You could imagine towards the edges there being a little spread of the foundation pushing sand out of the way, but in the middle it's all confined and going to be in a condition to become denser as it is loaded. So it'll become stronger as it's loaded and therefore can take on more load beneath the center than beneath the edge. So there's actually a difference based on what's happening with the sand. In clays, on the other hand, or cohesive soils, as this figure is identifying them, there would be a stress concentration towards the corner. And this is going to be based on the development of excess pore pressures that are occurring in that soil and it not going through this immediate densification due to slow drainage of those materials. So you do not have that little bubble occurring of higher stress in the middle. You actually have a lower stress occurring in the middle and a sharper edge, a higher stress, in other words, stress concentration around the boundary, especially at the corners. I hope that helps give some sense to this. We may return to this topic with settlement, but I think this will probably be, this is more or less the slide that I would hope to share at that stage. So I may just reflect back on this having been shown. Other questions or follow up to that, Kurt?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Good timing. That literally was the next image. So it seems a good time to grab a break, given that we're right at a change of topic here, about to move into stress distribution beneath foundations. And that's being a whole new thing. Rather than start for 2 or 3 minutes and then try to get back on that horse, let's grab a break first and then start fresh with that topic. And that will be, let's do 3:12. See you back in 11 minutes from now. All righty.